Well, good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host of Life Along the Merrimack. This is a podcast where we talk about the history and the health of the Merrimack River. And we've been doing this for some time. And often we talk about the Merrimack and the challenges it's had with it's getting dirtier, not cleaner. So that's of concern. But frequently also we talk about housing, the history of the community. And I'm really pleased to have historian Jack Santos here today. He's an author, and he's involved in learning about the housing in our community and some of the great old neighborhoods. Jack, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Dyke.
One of the things that Jack has created here in town is called, during Yankee Homecoming, it's a presentation, it's kind of a walking tour, and it's called If These Houses Could Talk. And it relates to the fact that many homes in this area are historic. They have interesting stories behind them. William Lloyd Garrison might have lived there. Caleb Cushing might have lived there. It's really very interesting. I think we all know that this is the housing stock is tremendous, but Jack has been able to work with homeowners and get the stories of many of these houses. So Jack, my question to you, you're a resident of Newburyport. How did you come upon this idea for bringing owners forward and having them tell the stories of their houses?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Dyke, and I attribute it all to my stepson, who at the time, this was probably about 10 years ago, was living in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, down in Boston. And we went down and visited him one weekend, and he said, "Jack, I got to take you outside. You probably would love this thing." And my interest in history was just starting to bud. I'd moved to Newburyport a few years earlier, and they had put on If This House Could Talk. And they had must have been 100, 150 homes in the Cambridgeport area where they put signs up and you walked around. So we spent a pleasant Saturday afternoon walking around Cambridgeport, reading all the signs. And some point along the way, he said, "You should do this in Newburyport." Because Cambridgeport, if you don't know Cambridgeport, their houses are merely 100 to 120 years old.
Newcomers on the scene.
Exactly. And he put the seed in my mind, and about 6 years later, it finally bubbled up to the top. We said, "Let's do it. Let's try this out in Newburyport."
So 2006, I believe, was the first year. How did you interest homeowners in doing it? Now you live on Spring Street, I believe. Did you interest your own neighbors, or did you go through larger channels?
I did. No, it's very, very grassroots, and I have to admit, I've got to thank a lot of neighbors and friends who, after they got over what it was about, takes a little bit of explaining. They were very enthusiastic. Neighbors put up signs, friends put up signs. Even that first year, we had this concept, which we're using this year, of team captains. So somebody on the street would be responsible for talking it up, do a little arm twisting, because sometimes people are a little reluctant about writing a story up on a sign and putting it up in front of their house. The first year, there were even questions like, "Oh, I already have a sign. I have a sign that says built by XYZ in 1894. What else do you want?" And I said, "No, this is different. This is a story that has a little bit more on it than just the builder or original owner of the house." Once people got used to that, they got used to the fact that it's just a poster board, that anything goes. If they wanted to draw pictures, or handwriting was fine. If your handwriting was messy, all the more fun it would be. Then people really got enthusiastic about it. And last year we had like 120 homes that participated.
Dude, that's remarkable. And in terms of you've actually pulled all this together and have had several books on it. I wonder if you could show your recent book, which shows a little about a cover, looks at Newburyport 2018, and that is available here in town at the Jabberwocky. And so if anyone wants to go out a copy, it's really interesting. But to most homeowners, know the history of their houses, Jack?
Well, now this is the funny part about this whole program. I like to say that we put the home back in Yankee homecoming, so people get to talk about their houses. And I'd say about 60, maybe 70% of the homes, the stories were historical stories about the house that homeowners had done some research on. And we have a fantastic resource here in Newburyport, the Newburyport Public Library Archival Center.
Yes.
And it's very easy to go down into the basement of the library, meet Sharon, who is the librarian there, and actually do some research on your house. For folks that have done it, they found that stories usually come up pretty quickly. There's one other aspect to that library archival center that's more recent is they've put all the Newburyport newspapers online. So you don't even have to go to a library. You can, from the comfort of your home, put in your address, put in the name of possibly somebody you knew that used to live there, and usually stories will pop up. But
well, I know Sharon Spieldenner, who you're talking about, who runs the archive downstairs. She's very approachable. She's very knowledgeable. So if any folks are listening now and wanted to learn more about their house, it certainly can be found down there, as you say, Jack. Now, you live on Spring Street, as I believe. Did you learn about your house, or did you fix up your house?
That's actually what got me interested. When we bought the house, the prior owner gave me a notebook with research that they had already done.
Really?
And so it was kind of a handed down. I think they may have even gotten some of it from an owner before them. And it wasn't much. It included a 3-page letter by Abraham Wheelwright to his son Jeremiah Wheelwright with advice of what to do now that he was a sea captain. Abraham was a sea captain and his son became a sea captain.
Well, the Wheelwrights had a house on High Street, did they not?
They did. The Wheelwrights moved here at around 1770, 1780. And they were originally, fairly poor. They came from a stalwart Brahmin family. They were in Maine for a good part of the early years, and a branch of the family settled in Newburyport. They weren't that wealthy, so they had houses on Milk Street. They had houses on Spring Street. Eventually, when they made their money after the Revolutionary War, they traded those houses up for the houses on High Street.
Yes.
And there are 3 that are right next to each other. It's Abraham's house, which is today is Brigham Manor Nursing Home. Next to that is Abraham's nephew. And next to that was Abraham's brother, Ebenezer Wheelwright. And they're probably the grandest house on the 3
well,
houses.
it does show upward mobility.
Yeah.
On the subject of High Street, we had a historian here recently on the show, Reg Bacon, and we were talking about High Street, and he mentioned that a lot of the houses, well, the golden era of building on High Street was about 1790 to about 1812, as I understand it. And he mentioned that a lot of the shipbuilders at that time were building ships for the slave trade. It's believed that no one actually was in the slaving business, but they would sell them to companies in England or other areas, and they would use them as slave vehicles. Did you ever hear this? I mean, is that
absolutely.
Is that
absolutely.
part of it?
Although I would say the Newburyport's history with slavery and the slave trade is kind of something people don't like to publicize or wasn't talked a lot about. In fact, there's only one known case of a Newburyport slave trader. That's been named. His name was Robert Todd. The house that he lived in today had a sign on it explaining a lot of this. The homeowners have done the research on it. It's a condo. It has multiple condos in it. 100 State Street, right next to the library. And the reason we know he's a slave trader, this ties to William Lloyd Garrison, is that in Baltimore, William Lloyd Garrison publicly accused him of being a slave trader. Todd took him to court, sued him for libel, and at that time, and I think this could still be true, you could be sued for libel even though what you're saying is true, and it just means you've impugned their reputation in public. Garrison lost, went to jail, and in the trial, the captain of the ship testified in favor of Garrison and said, "Oh, absolutely, we've been moving slaves all over the place." But that's the only known case of a Newburyport slave trader.
Well, that's a fascinating anecdote, and I must say that Garrison himself was not that popular here in Newburyport in the run-up to the war. He's been lionized since then. There's a huge statue in front of City Hall, but because he was such an abolitionist, many people were still making their money from international trade, perhaps slavery. Now, slavery in this country, was outlawed in 1808 in terms of bringing new slaves in, but you could build ships that brought them elsewhere. So that's a wonderful anecdote. It ran through my mind. Is William Lloyd Garrison's house, is that part of the tour? I've walked past there and I've seen the sign on the outside, but I didn't know if it's on the tour.
It isn't. There are a few homes in the city, and I give a talk. I've got a talk coming up here at the Senior Center in May with the I think it's the Newburyport. Oh gosh, I should have been prepared for this neighborhood group. But and in the talk, I outlined about 3 or 4 homes that I wish had put signs up. Garrison is one of those homes. Garrison's home that he was born in it's behind Old South Church. And actually, the fact that he grew up behind Old South Church is probably what influenced him to be so ethical and moral and be anti-slavery. He attended the church, but that house really, I think it's a rental. Somebody owns it. There's a few plaques on it, but it hasn't really celebrated its heritage as Garrison's birthplace.
One of the things I liked about your book is there are little anecdotes here and there that bring out facts I was not aware of. But evidently in about 1855, state law enabled women to buy and own property. I was surprised it was that late along the way because, just because. Did you find that women took interest in buying houses? And of course, now many of our real estate professionals are women.
Yeah, that was the Abby Foster house, also on High Street. And I have to give credit to Mary Baker Eaton, who is just a fantastic supporter of this program, of This House Could Talk, since we started it. She's been a great colleague in pulling this off. And she did a lot of the research about that house. Yeah, and it's interesting. Yeah, as you said, women could only men could own property up until that point, and that's one of the first houses that was bought for and built by a woman. But that's not to say, and this is an area of This House Could Talk that I'd like to explore further in coming years. Newburyport was actually very progressive when it came to women. We had one of the first women high schools in the country.
The female high school.
Yeah, so it was.
I don't remember it. I'm aware of it.
So it's not like we didn't really understand the role of women, but society as a whole, as we know, it wasn't until women got the vote many years later.
That's right. And another social note that I was intrigued by. On Spring Street, and this may have been your house, I don't know your number, but there was a note that a man left his house to his housekeeper, who had been in the house for 18 years, and he left the house, the business, and all the appurtenances, and his family challenged the will, and as I understand it, the family lost. This must have been an awkward moment, but certainly for the housekeeper, a great legal victory.
Yeah, that is my house. That's one of the intriguing things. The history of my house started with a Revolutionary War veteran who fought in Boston. He fought at the Battle of Long Island and Brooklyn, and he crossed the Delaware with Washington. And then when he came back, at that time in the Revolution, he only signed up for a year. He decided to become a privateer, and that's where where he learned the trade of shipping and then became very wealthy, Abraham Wheelwright. But when I did the research, I continued following the thread of owners and found Nicholas Lake, who lived there in 1860. He lived there until 1900. He died in 1900. And a very interesting story about this, because when you do research on houses, you usually go to Salem Deeds, you follow the trail of deeds, and it's kind of like a puzzle. I couldn't get past Lake. At 1900, the trail went cold. I couldn't figure out who lived there after until they were very helpful at Salem, and they said, well, maybe you got to look at his will. So I had to go across town in Salem to probate. Dug up his will. They dusted it out from the basement. And sure enough, in the will, it says, I leave it to my housekeeper of 18 years. She lived there for another 18 years until 1918, and it was a boarding home. With at the time that she died in 1918 and it got passed on, there were something like 10 children living in the house.
Well, that's an intriguing story. And, of course, Newburyport goes back to about 1635, when it was part of Newbury, became the city, or became its own community in 1764. But one of the great stories in housing was the Great Fire of 1811. When you have been going over history and some of the housing charts, was this does this loom large as a demarcation point in history?
Yeah, it does. It looms large because there's a lot of homes in the center of the city that were burnt down. Like, for instance, on the corner of Fair and Middle, there was a church there, a Baptist church that they actually moved during the fire, moved everybody's furniture into that church to save it. And then the fire reached the church, and all the church burned down.
Yeah.
So everybody lost everything. That fire factored big. That's one of the reasons Abraham Wheelwright, who owned my home, he moved from Spring Street, built the house in 1806 on High Street, Brigham Manor Nursing Home today, and then had to sell it in 1813 because he lost everything in the fire of 1811.
And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much brick building downtown, in the square and at the Bullnose, because as I understand it, the town went to the state legislature and said, we need some help. And the state said, well, we will help you, but you must rebuild with brick. Yeah. And so that turned out to be, in terms of historic elements, it's such a attractive downtown. It's won many architectural awards, and so brick became important.
Well, not only is it drawing tourists because of the architectural beauty, but that decision is affecting us to the current day. Abraham Bagels with that fire, that whole block would have gone if they hadn't built the brick firewall that was legislated in 1811.
That's a good point. Well, I'm learning a lot, which is why I'm always excited. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson, the host. I'm with historian Jack Santos. And one of the other fires, Jack, as I understand it, although it was large also, was the $1 Million Fire of 1934. Now, that cleared out some area down near the waterfront, and some of it, there were factories at the time, and some of it is still open ground.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. No, it hasn't been developed. That was mostly warehouse space that burnt down. There were only a few homes that actually burnt down. But one of my other interests, kind of an offshoot of this house could talk, was research into the local tower clocks. We have our share of church tower clocks. And that fire has a tie to the clock in the Temple Street Church Center Congregational. I've visited that clock, and we noticed when we were visiting, we said, wow, this clock is all black. I know they paint these clocks, the clockworks, with green paint, but it's covered with black. We would smudge the clock, and it came off on our fingers. I said, this is soot. It was soot from the 1930 $1 million fire had covered that clock, and is still there to this day.
Well, you have several interests in terms of history, and I believe one of them is the trip that Benedict Arnold engaged upon. He and a group of military folk I'm thinking I'll let you say the exact year, but they actually started in Newburyport, went to Maine, went up to Kennebec, and went to Quebec City. And can you talk a little about that? Because I heard you speak. It was fantastic. And of course, one of my favorite books ever is Arundel by Kenneth Roberts, and that's a historical novel that recreated that. Can you talk about your interest in Benedict Arnold, who at one time was quite a legitimate person?
Yeah, he was he was a hero, really. And in fact, we had a play that was put on by the Actors Studio in the Firehouse this past year called Treason, that was about Benedict Arnold. My interest in Benedict in that expedition actually came out of the house, because, again, going back to Abraham Wheelwright, the original owner and builder of my home on Spring Street, when Abraham went to in 1770, at the end of 1775, Abraham went with Washington to Trenton. Abraham's father went with Arnold to Canada. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine this scene, father and son, just wishing each other good luck. One's going north, the other's going south to fight for this country, for independence from England, and that's what got me started. I started looking into that. The Arnold expedition that Jeremiah Wheelwright, Abraham's father, was on. Jeremiah died on that expedition.
Well, from Kenneth Roberts' book Arundel, and also from the notes, that was a very difficult trip. Of course, there were no roads after you got past Augusta or Skowhegan. Beyond that, don't start a trip in October, because right. the winter closes in fast. And I believe when they got to Quebec City, it was around Christmas, it was snowing, and those guys must have been tough. I'm telling you, to keep, guys, we got 10 more miles. I know there's 3 feet of snow, but we got to keep going. It was a remarkable journey, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is. It was wilderness. They kind of underestimated the difficulty. The snow came in sooner. They lost probably about half of the 1,200 men force, but by the time they got to Quebec City, they met up with another group of soldiers that had come up via Montreal, led by General Schuyler, and they were ready to attack Quebec. Can you imagine that? They go through that, they lose half of their people, and they still attack Quebec City. And in fact, the interesting thing about that, they almost got it. If they attacked the city, they were scaling the walls, they had broken through the door, and then suddenly a British soldier turned around in a wild fit of anger, just shot his gun at the American troops, and he killed one of the leaders, and it caused the troops to panic, and they ran away, and we lost the battle.
That was an amazing story, and we all know, the backwoods of Maine can be a tough place, but reading the Kenneth Roberts book was really significant. And one thing, when we talk about shipbuilding, and of course Newburyport was a premier shipbuilder, this community was known for having a lot of great home builders and carpenters of houses. Was that partially, do you feel, because they did so much work on the ships here in town?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when the shipbuilding trade, either through economics or whatever, would go into a lull, they'd turn around, the people who were building the ships would turn around and build houses. So you can see that in a lot of the homes in town, for sure. And not only that, the actual the ship designers also lived in town, and their houses are still standing. So folks who actually will do the research on their homes, they may find that a famous ship owner or ship designer lived in the house, and they had no idea that was the case.
Well, I'm speaking with Jack Santos, a historian who has done a lot in looking in terms of the history of the community, the history of houses, and runs a program in the summer, If This House Could Talk. There's one myth in town. I call it a myth because I've asked a lot of people. But when we moved here, we always heard there was an underground tunnel that ran from High Street to the wharves, where supposedly the wealthy merchants could bring up some content and not pay taxes on it. What is your thought? And I do call it a myth. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I'm not sure. There are vestiges of tunnels, but in some cases, I think if I read the tea leaves right, those tunnels really were kind of like sewers, large sewers, or water, where water could get funneled to go down to the river. They weren't necessarily there for the kinds of things that you mentioned, trying to smuggle in goods or hide runaway slaves or whatever.
We were talking about slavery before, and we've lionized the Underground Railroad here, and so a lot of people do feel that there was an underground tunnel. But I remember I was with the Daily News for about 6 or 7 years until recently, and one day there was a big problem down in front of the new restaurant, the New Black Cow, and so rumor got around, okay, there's an open tunnel here. This must be where the rum was taken or the slaves were taken. So Mayor Donna Holiday actually got on a 10-foot ladder, went down with the city engineer. And what they all came up with is just what you said, that, they're old pipes for water drainage and that type of thing. But for years I heard, well, this is, people would go down there and get away from their taxes. But I do believe what you say.
But I will say, I mean, there's always a kind of a seed of doubt in my mind. Even today, one of the homes that's for sale on High Street, they just converted to condominiums. I don't know if that unit, there's like 4 or 6 units in that home that are condos now. One of the units has a vestige of a tunnel that goes about halfway under High Street, and then it's blocked off.
Really?
So whether that is somebody's idea of a wine cellar at one point or something like that, some place to store food, or was actually part of a broader tunnel system, I'll leave it to people's imagination.
Well, we should probably keep these myths going, except we are historians and arguably, are trying to get the good truth out. In terms of the houses that you've seen, do you have a favorite house in town or a couple houses that you like the stories about? Like the one that we recollected where the housekeeper got the house in the business and the family lost out, just stuck in my mind. Are there other houses that have unique little tales?
Oh my gosh, there's so many of them. It's hard to really pick a favorite, but the stories that I enjoy the most are the stories that kind of pull on your heartstrings. They're not necessarily, you don't have to, I want people to understand it doesn't have to be a major history story. It could be just something, if they're going to put a sign up on your house for if this house could talk, it could be your family history. It could be just something that happened last week that you thought was funny. So it doesn't have to be super historical. The one that comes to mind is there's a couple of homes where they found tombstones like buried in the back or in the house someplace, and it was only discovered in the last 10-20 years, but it's usually tombstones that were thrown away, that they were discarded, and they kept them around the home.
Well, one of the cute notes from your book is the Grog, which is, of course, a popular restaurant in town, and it has its, founded in built in about 1811, and there's a little sign, if this building could talk, and there's a sign next to it that says, and on occasion it does. And I'm sure the number of tales from the Grog over the years, and it's only been the Grog for about the last 50 years. There was many other things before that. But that seems like a building with many stories.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. And, of course, there's always the ghost stories, right? Like Ted Center probably has I think even the mayor has attested to the fact that she felt a ghost presence at Ted Center when she was working there one year. Yeah, those, especially in the center of town, and the brick buildings, there's a lot of stories there. That's another area that's worth exploring for future, if this house could talk, is have more of a business focus on it. This past year, the Institution for Savings put up a sign. It was a fascinating sign about that building, which is a spectacular building. They're renovating it now, redoing the brownstone on the outside. But I'd like to see businesses do more in terms of putting up signs about the history of their business.
Well, just to recap, I'm with Jack Santos, a historian who runs the program in August during Yankee Homecoming, If This House Could Talk. And this has been very educational for me, Jack. Thank you very much for doing so. What do you do as your day job? As I understand it, you're in the computer field, and you actually, don't rummage through all archives all the time, but you work a regular day.
Yeah, I work with bits and bytes. I'm a technology analyst for a company, and it got my interest in doing a little bit more history.
Well, your history's been great. You've had 2 books on it, and that's, very entertaining. So we're going to end our presentation now. Jack Santos, historian who started the program If This House Could Talk. If you could show your book again, Jack, that would be helpful. It's available downtown in Jabberwocky if you want to pick it up. It's very informative and very much fun. And I learned a lot, and that's one of my great goals. So that's it for the day. Thank you very much, and we'll be back next week for Life Along the Merrimack. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dyke.